brought to you by Dale Carnegie of Orange County. This is the 411 on Leadership podcast, where we discuss common sense leadership practices with executives in Southern California to transform you into the leader people want to follow.
Good Monday morning. This is the 411 on Leadership, brought to you by Dale Carnegie of Orange County, powered by Sitch Radio. Again, if you've got any questions or thoughts about podcasting, reach out to Sitch Radio. Brian Colburn is the man who will get you set up with that. To my right, co-host and the fabulous, the amazing Regional Vice President for Dale Carnegie here in Orange County, Mr. Steve Thomas. Good morning, Steve.
Hey, good morning. Any more compliments? You might make me blush over here. So thank you. I appreciate that. With all that introduction, this young, fine gentleman right here forgot to introduce himself. He is John Campbell. He is the Director of Missions Relations at Pacific Justice Institute. And we are here on another Monday. Can you believe that we are 12 podcasts in 12? So we want to say thank you for all of us for joining us. Today, for all of you. I said inclusive language, my friend. Inclusive language. So that's what we do at Dale Carnegie. Well, we have been in this series focused on inclusive leadership and what specifically contributors are looking for in their leaders. And this is based from competencies of inclusive leaders, when employees. One, it was a study that was found in the LinkedIn Learning Program, Inclusive Leadership, with Dr. Shirley Davis. And so we have the pleasure of introducing to the podcast and having this young lady with us, joining us. Her name is Traci Shirachi. She is the CEO and president of the Mark USA Incorporated, which is a data analytics applied research company comprised of about over 15 employees based in Southern California that works both with organizations nationally and internationally. And so Traci, she is actively involved in the Center Club, which is an Orange County advisors. Let me start that back because I don't know. I gotta get on the coffee thing.
Get some coffee.
Rewind.
Going.
Here we go. It's a Monday. All right. So she is actively involved in the Center Club. She is an Orange County Advisors in Philanthropy member. Thank you very much. I got that right. And a board member of Wise Place. She was honored in 2019 and 2020 as the Orange County Business Journal's Women in Business, and also honored in 2020 and 2021 for Women in Entrepreneurship. She's got over 18 years of work experience, and she is just someone that is, I don't know, because we're both from New York, I think there's like that commonality and camaraderie there. So I'm excited to have her join us. Traci, welcome to the podcast. How's everything going?
It's going great. Thanks, Steve and John, for having me. I'm super excited, and please do forgive me for the sound in the background.
Traci is in the middle of construction, so she does construction on the side. Just kidding.
That's becoming a job.
She's got to do a little side hustle. So, Traci, we're so grateful to have you on the program and just to learn more about your story. So, Traci, tell us about your leadership journey so far, and how did it lead to your understanding of being authentic and transparent in leadership?
Well, I think, throughout my journey as a leader, both in corporate, but even more recently as leader of my own company, I think what's been really important over the last year, especially during COVID, is authenticity and transparency in terms of being genuine and being honest about where you are as a leader. I think there's a lot of pressure for leaders to have all the answers and to be right. And the honest truth is none of us are going to be right. We have an answer, but it constantly needs to be improved and changed over time. And so adaptability and flexibility in leadership, I think, is really key, and I think has been the epitome of my own career, as well as I've morphed and changed and gone into different fields and really just changed with the times. So I think, especially during, this last pandemic, for a lot of us as leaders, it's a lot about adaptability, assurance, but being honest with our people in terms of if we don't have an answer, just being honest about such, but providing potential solutions, right? Potential thoughts. And that provides, I think, greater reassurance to individuals that you don't just say, I don't know, and leave it at that. And then everyone is looking for some kind of direction, but more importantly, being able to propose ideas and really engage people to also be encouraged to submit their own ideas. And that's really the collective leadership or the common good of an organization that I think is really what today is about in terms of leadership. It's no one person per se.
Yeah. Traci, can I follow up with you? Now, you talked about being honest with your team. And a lot of times we as leaders, even if we're honest, sometimes we hold back on some information, right? Because we don't want people to know if we don't know the answer or something. How did you come to that decision? Oh, and we agree with you, by the way, that honesty is the best policy because of so many things. But how did you get to that point as a leader to kind of overcome that desire to want to hold back on that and to say, even if we don't know, to pretend at least that you know all the answers?
So I think what's interesting is prior to last March, we were actually studying Dare to Lead, which was a series by Brene Brown. And she talks a lot about the fundamental of leadership is about vulnerability. And vulnerability is something that human beings aren't comfortable with. We aren't comfortable with being vulnerable. However, what the pandemic really did was expose our vulnerabilities at the highest level. And what that also requires is this honesty with oneself that no one has ever been through a pandemic. No one knows what that's like. Those that have been through something similar are long gone now, right? So for those that have not been through a pandemic, I think it's being honest about the fears and the uncertainty. But I think it really comes down to the core, not only of vulnerability, but the relationships that we form as human beings with each other. And what leaders have to acknowledge within an organization is you're managing people, right? And those individuals have a relationship with you and you have a relationship with them. And it's as simple and as easy in a lot of ways as being honest in that relationship, right? And so for me, when we were going through the pandemic, there were times where I wasn't sure what was going to happen. I mean, we were in, for instance, a office and we ended up giving our office up in 2 months, right? And we did that by nature of me predicting or anticipating that we were not going to go back to the office in any period of time that I could anticipate. It would be at least a year, if not 2 years. And all the while, as a company, you're incurring this cost of having an office. And at the same time, you also have to think about the safety of your employees. Are they going to feel comfortable sitting next to each other? I mean, if you just take the common cold, for instance, right? People spread it in the office, just common cold, right? Flu season, one person's sick, all of a sudden everybody in the whole row is sick, or, so just knowing that, it was just being honest and saying, hey, these are the things that we need to do, and these are the reasons behind it. But being very honest that this is a lot of stress, this is going to cause a lot of anxiety because it's change, it's quick, it's fast, but these are the reasons why we're doing it. And this is my thought process behind it. And I think just like in any relationship, we usually explain our thought processes. We usually explain what we're feeling. So communication is really critical. But I think that vulnerability aspect is treating your job, and that's, I think, where it's really hard, is treating your job no different than any other relationship that you have. But it's hard because we wired ourselves to believe, okay, what's the difference between being personal and being professional, and where's that line? And in this particular case, I think with regards to the pandemic, you're talking about those two bleeding together very often, right? And all of us are now very comfortable with like kids interrupting, construction going on in the background. You guys seen like the back, it's not like a formal setting that's, all nice and spoofed up, right? It's like everybody is very comfortable with this genuineness, authenticity of personal and professional. And I think that's the same thing with leadership, is being professional is still acting in a formal manner, being polite, right? Not, there's certain protocols right in place, but in terms of what that entails, you're a human being as a leader, right? When you go, you're a human being. And I think that's really what individuals have to acknowledge early on.
It's funny. One of the things that I picked up as you were saying that, Traci, was be professional, not perfect. And
Mm-hmm.
so it's really important for
Yeah.
us because you do have it where you have the other side of leaders that they're saying, well, they would sometimes make hasty decisions. They're like, well, you know what, this is just being me, or I'm just being real. But then there's that they're not being professional, you know what I mean? Or they're using that as a justification for making impulsive decisions that are not benefiting the organization. And so, you know, you just mentioning this, the idea of us being professional as leaders, I mean, that is definitely something that is profound for our group. And so, Tracy, I'd like to, in the same vein of being authentic and transparent, you know, in addition to, you know, what's been going on with the pandemic, you know, obviously, you know, this has been a time where we have seen an increase of hate, you know, as
Mm-hmm.
to the Asian American community. And so I'm curious to hear from you as an Asian American CEO, like, you know, what's been your journey through that and how has that impacted your leadership?
I think it's caused me to reflect more, which I think has been a really healthy process, not only for me professionally, but personally, in
Mm,
terms of what does that mean for me as a leader, but also acknowledging like why aren't there as many maybe Asian American female CEOs or leaders in organizations? And it's a very interesting aspect, I think, of culture, but it's also a very interesting aspect of leadership where it's caused me to not necessarily question my own decisions or weaknesses per se as a leader, but it's very much provided greater awareness. So, for instance, I think, you know, all of us as leaders lack confidence at some point, right? Even though you see leaders as always being very confident, very assured, very decisive, right? That's very much what we're supposed to be. But the human aspect of it is we do lack confidence. We are indecisive. We are unsure of decision making and that type of thing. And so it's interesting because I think culturally, um, especially within the Asian culture, to be bold, to be very articulate, to be a lot of things goes against what we consider is lack of humility, right? Too much ego, too much self, too much. And so, you know, same thing with the times. I think, you know, with in any case, when there's discrimination or there's something that's happened, culturally, Asians very much suppress that aspect of what's gone on. And it's very much heads down, get through it, focus on what counts, you know, just get through it. And it's not
mm,
really about bringing awareness to it or talking about it or acknowledging it. And I think that is, it's both helped, but it's also hurt, very much hurt us as individuals too, because we don't talk about what we've gone through. We don't talk about what's going on. And I think in terms of leadership, we should be talking about it. We
Yeah.
found that there's, you know, healing, there's learning, there's growth that comes from being able to talk about things. And you have to be comfortable about talking about that. And it's an interesting dynamic for me, I think, personally, because I'm fourth generation. So there's certain cultural tenets that I very much understand, um, being an Asian American female, but there's also other aspects where I've seen generationally we've had to overcome. I
mm,
think back to a conversation my grandfather had with me as a young child and my grandmother, where learning English was the fastest, clearest path in their mind for the first generation that came, my great grandparents, to success in the US. So it almost got to the point where you had to shed any um, relationship or any cultural ties to um, where you came from for the purpose of assimilation, right? And
mm.
so I think that's a common story for a lot of everybody who's come to this country, right? Is there's a need to assimilate, to adapt, to in order to further advance social economically. Well, at the same time, what are we giving up by doing that? That's our own sense of identity or culture, right? And
Mm.
so I think each one of us grapples with that. And I think what's interesting about this time is you go through that self discovery phase of yourself as a leader to really understand what are aspects of your race or culture that do influence you as an individual, but also don't necessarily define you as an individual.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
So thank you. That we're talking with Traci Shirachi. She is the CEO of the Mark USA Incorporated. And Brian, you had a question. But I'm sorry, before you do, Brian, he's gonna do it. If you, I'm sorry. I was looking at the producer, looking at John. I was looking at man, my apologies. My apologies. My apologies, John. My apologies. So before we go on, John, if you are enjoying this content, please go ahead and like and subscribe or share. And even if you have questions for Traci, we'd love to see your comment. We've got one comment coming in from Cecile Thomas, who says this podcast. Thank you very much, Cecile. It's very good, especially for Asian leaders and professionals. So thank you so much, Traci, for giving of your time and really sharing of your perspective.
That's right.
John, you have a question. He is John.
Thank you, Steve, for that. Traci, we appreciate it. And one of the things that I thought of when we think of transparency and leadership and the things that you shared about is one of our Dale Carnegie principles, Steve, number 17, is to try honestly to see things from other people's point of view. And in a society time, I'm not saying that right, in a time in our society,
there you go. Yep.
where we're recognizing or there's being brought to the forefront some of the challenges our culture here in the United States has had with people of different colors, different races, racial backgrounds, and trying to cross the aisle, so to speak, and say, what is it that they're going through? What is it that they're experiencing? And, I appreciate that, Traci. And I know that as we're talking specifically today about being transparent and even in some ways, as you talk about vulnerable, and the fact that you acknowledge that and recognize and say, hey, I'm a female, I'm of Asian American background and heritage. There's a vulnerability even in stating that a lot of times as a leader and acknowledging maybe some of the differences, because there can be reactions to people. But I think, as you talked about, Traci, there's healing and understanding come when we dialogue. And I know that not too long ago, you issued a statement on behalf of the organization in regards to some of the crimes and things we've seen against the Asian American Pacific Islander community.
Yeah, and I think a lot of it is acknowledging, for me, it's the human connection, right? It's about belonging. And so even though we put a lot of focus on race and races, right? I really think that the key tenet across all these discussions is about the human aspect of what makes us hurt. So the ability to inflict pain towards somebody and to receive pain is a human attribute that is across all genders, across all races, and so one thing that, as we talk about inclusivity, right? Being inclusive is acknowledging the commonalities and what, as human beings, do we need, and a sense of belonging. And diversity too is more than just gender, race, orientation. It's so much more powerful and richer than that. It's about experiences, right? And as individuals, and I really do mean every individual has a different story, a different experience, a different even within the same race, right? And it's that wealth of experience and connection and belonging that really is where I truly believe all of us should be dialing into during this time, is that sense of community, right? Like if you think back to older generations, I even think in my own family, coming from both Chinese and Japanese descent, the tightness of that community and the tightness of people in general occurred during World War II, World War I, the Depression, times of like horrific change, right? And that's really what's gone on today. Is during the pandemic, not only is it a national thing, but it's a global thing, but it's also bringing parties together. And to really elevate leadership is to really acknowledge that need for togetherness and that need for helping each other and lifting each other up. And I'm not saying that just to be warm and fuzzy and to create like warm and fuzzy feelings, but it really is, when we talk about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and we're talking about what's going on during this time, it's really acknowledging that it's all races, all people, and at the same time, acknowledging differences too, the cultural differences that exist, so that we can learn and grow from it, but be better people because we're now learning about other people groups, right? That
Yeah.
we didn't know anything about, and creating the safety to ask questions about other people that maybe we're afraid to ask a friend or someone we knew about what their experience or their life has been like.
So, Traci, along those same lines, for those CEOs or presidents that are watching this podcast, um, my question for you would be like, so why should they care about this? So, I mean, when we talk about the inclusivity, we're talking about being authentic and transparent. It does sound a little bit fluffy. And so probably in mind of a CEO like yourself, it's like, okay, if they're a public company, I gotta keep my shareholders happy. I've got to make sure, where our revenue is up, especially now we're trying to make up lost time. So what word would you have for those CEOs or presidents that are listening to this and saying, hey, you know what? Why should I care about this? Why should this be something that would be important to me for me to really look at and for really, be an initiative that I drive within my organization?
I say because it's everything and literally everything. So I've been reading a book called Power Broke by Damon, and he was talking about in this last decade alone, the individual is the most powerful unit for any business. So if you think about that, like you said, Steve, like you're talking about your shareholders, your corporate boards, your consumer, whether or not you have a product company or a service company, right? Your employee. Like community, everything comes down to the sum of the parts, which are these individuals, right, making decisions. They're the ones that decide whether or not they buy or they don't buy, right? And it comes down to the individual. So you have to care as a CEO about what individuals believe, how they feel, how they think, what drives them. And it's a very challenging time, no doubt, as a CEO of a company, because you can't have enough data points on all the individuals that are out there and what they're feeling and thinking, yet they're driving everything, right? If media gets a hold of something that someone doesn't like because a company, didn't know about XYZ going on and it's causing, polluted water, whatever it may be, right? The media runs with it. Individuals get a hold of that. It becomes a PR nightmare, right? For any company. I mean, the power of the individual, and it's not just the individuals that you can touch and feel. It's the individual that could be in a totally different country, in a totally different place that you've never met. I mean, the reach that we have today with social media, the internet, it's amazing. And to the point, as a leader, you are managing all of that, right? You're managing every aspect of that.
Mm. We're talking about Traci Shirachi. She is the CEO and president of the Mark USA Incorporated. And so, Traci, the question that we have, and John can piggyback on this as well. Traci, for those that are listening to this podcast, those leaders that are watching or will be listening when it's on Spotify and Apple iTunes, what is that one what is that one practice that leaders can come away with and could adopt this week to be more transparent and authentic with both their teams and or their clients?
I think the one practice that leaders can come away with is creating dialogue within an organization, right? Being able to create a means and a feedback loop by which you can talk to individuals and obtain feedback. So obviously for us as I guess you could say as a data company, as an evaluation company, right? We're constantly talking about data frameworks, but we're also talking about that feedback loop of information to validate and invalidate your thinking and the information that you have at your disposal for making decisions, right? So having that open feedback loop and that dialogue is really critical, because that's really where you're going to hear what people think, what they feel, what they're going through. And without that, it's really hard as a leader to be able to navigate, a very complex landscape right now without that feedback loop. And
And
so
I
for
think that is a fantastic way for those to create that authenticity. What's a step? I'm going to drill down on that a little bit with you, Traci. What's a step that a leader can do to create that dialogue loop?
So what we like to do is talk a lot about data frameworks and starting out with what outcomes you're trying to achieve first. Like, what is most important, big picture, and what really draws in all these different stakeholders within an organization, as complex as they are, into key tenets? What is it that they all really centralize around, right? And what is it that you're trying to accomplish and drive for as a whole organization? It's not just your output of your initiatives and your programs and how much money you're spending, but really, like, what are you trying to achieve with all these different diverse stakeholders? And then second off, it's thinking about, okay, now that I have a better understanding of what that is and everybody's dialed into that, how do I measure that? And what's the best approach that I should take to really gather that information, and who should I be approaching for that information, right? And then from there, you're analyzing that information. So it really is an approach and a methodology and a practice by which you're involving multiple stakeholders, from employees to boards to consumers to, I mean, anybody and everybody that you believe is important to your organization. That's who you're all dialing into a common data framework to gather that information from all those different parties. And that makes it easier for those leaders, because now they've got one common source of information, but they're dialoguing with all these different parties simultaneously.
She is Traci Shirachi from with the Mark. And John, I think you had one more question.
Well, that was it. I was going to say, Steve, as we look at finishing today's discussion, as we're talking about that transparency, authenticity, what's another step? I know that we've got some things that you've worked on with leaders before, specifically about kind of carrying that forward. What are some of those things you can share with us today?
Well, really, it's all about us building relationships with our, with our members of our team. If we're talking about being authentic and transparent, a simple but hardest thing that we can do when it's appropriate. I think of Dale Carnegie's principle number 12. If you're wrong, admit it quickly and emphatically. There's nothing that builds more trust and authenticity more than saying, hey, you know what? In this particular case, I was wrong on this one.
Yeah.
Here's what we could do to move forward. Or, hey, you know what do you think we could do to move forward? So again, it's like you said, Traci, not we're being professional, not perfect, but we are being professional and really, galvanizing the team and saying, hey, you know what? This is where I was wrong on this. Let's, see if we can figure out a solution together on how to move forward. And so, that would be the one thing I would think. And Traci, getting back to you before, we wrap up this podcast, tell us a little bit more about the Mark and what you all are doing there.
So we're working with businesses and organizations of all types in terms of helping them with this data framework. And what I like about what you said, Steve, is, there's nothing wrong with being wrong. And I think what we help do is not necessarily point out where individuals are wrong per se, but where they can improve. So it's really using the data to identify where you're lacking. But because you're able to acknowledge where something is lacking, you're now able to deploy resources towards that area or towards that problem area or issue, and now turn it around. And so I think the beautiful part about being wrong, and this is an aspect of ourselves as leaders we kind of have to rewire, is there's nothing wrong with being wrong, because at least you acknowledge it and you're able to change the course of what you're doing, versus continuing down a path thinking you're right and you're really wrong, right? So I mean, there's a aha moment, and there's freedom in that as a leader to be able to have the information you need at your disposal to really affirm what you're doing right, but also point out areas where you're lacking so that you can correct it, to also make sure that you're doing those things right too. And that's, for me, it's like, you need constant affirmation as a leader. There's that insecurity or that lack of confidence, or that aspect of yourself that you always have to feel like you have the answer, right? And so to kind of compensate for that, it's nice to having affirming information to make you feel more confident, to make you feel better, but also you're able to be more vulnerable because you have no fears left. It's very freeing, I think, for leaders.
So Traci, where else can our listeners connect with you online? First and foremost, we know that you have a podcast. And
Yes.
so if you mind just sharing with us, a little bit about your podcast and where else can listeners connect with you?
Sure. So it's called Driving Outcomes, and it's by Traci Shirachi, and it's on behalf of the Mark. And what we're really doing is sharing the outcomes and work, not only of academic institutions and professors in those organizations, but also nonprofit organizations as well as companies. One of our most recent podcasts that's upcoming is called CSR Hub. So CSR Hub is going to be sharing what they did. And then also one of the great ways is connect with me through LinkedIn. So it's Traci Shirachi on LinkedIn, and also through email. One of the best ways that I love to communicate and connect and set up meetings with individuals is tshirachi@themarkusa.com. So
And we'll make sure to have those links listed there on the webpage. So those that are watching on YouTube, you can see that Facebook or LinkedIn Live. And Traci, we really appreciate your time with us. Thanks so much. I mean, this half hour went really fast. And once again, we appreciate you for watching and for joining us here at the 411 on Leadership. Please make sure that you like, subscribe, share this with those that are around. That's really the point, Steve, why we came together for the 411 on Leadership, is to share that with leaders, some of those principles and things that we've learned in leadership, and how can we see other leaders succeed.
Definitely. Thanks, John. And we'll go more into that next week, where we get to, recap what we've heard these last few podcasts, because it's all been some really, really great information. If you're looking into moving forward into increasing the effectiveness of your leadership, you can visit us at ocdalecarnegie.com. For Traci, the Mark USA, how to reach her podcast, there's all going to be with the show notes. So you should be able to see contact information for her. You can reach out to her on LinkedIn. Also, you could visit her website, visit her podcast, Driving Outcomes as well. And what's going on at the Pacific Justice Institute, John?
We're continuing to fight for one of the things that we do is to defend religious freedom. And that's an area that we work daily on.
Awesome.
So, yeah.
Well, great. Well, listen, John, we want to say how much we appreciate Traci being a part of the podcast. John, we appreciate you. You are John, not Brian. So
there is a Brian. He's over there.
Brian's our producer who always takes care of us. My name is Steve, and we're just so grateful to have each and every one of you join us. Have a wonderful week. And remember, managers light a fire under people, while leaders light a fire in people. Have a great week.